it's good to see you. I trust, therefore, that you got back safely to the motherland, England, after your trip to Accra, Ghana, where we were both participants in the Accra Conference on Reparations set up by the AU and supported, of course, by CARICOM. Well, what were your impressions?
I was very, very impressed that the president of Ghana, through his official backing behind it, and the rulers of countries like Burundi, countries like Togo, and so on, all made a very impressive showing. And it was good to see the African Union taking this on. So I was very, very impressed.
Mm-hmm.
I also feel very proud that our MP, Belrabiro Adi, put in such a good showing. So I thought that was fantastic.
Yes, I mean, especially since she had her duties in Parliament and she had to fly back, I think, after the first day.
That's right. That's right.
I'm not sure that she made it back, but she did make a good presentation. And of course, she's carrying the torch there in England on every occasion that she has. Just an interesting perspective as we say that the African Union has come on board.
Mm-hmm.
A little how should I say? Not so much misunderstanding, but I think what was happening was, shall we say, a differential approach between the nations, African nations, and CARICOM towards reparations and civil society. Not so much a different approach, but maybe one not understanding the other.
Yeah.
And I think the case, I think, clearly has to be made by nations.
Mm-hmm.
African nations, Caribbean nations, those are the main ones that we're talking about at the present time. Whereas civil society does, however, have its role in terms of the general public and the education and the understanding that the general public has to have and the fact that the general public has to support very much emotionally and otherwise the presentation by the different country representatives. What's your take on that? Did you see any of that happening?
Yes, I did. I think that a lot of the, if you like, disagreement is that I think a lot of Black people that live in the West, and by the West, I mean the Americas, where they are not the majority population, but they are minority populations. Mm-hmm. I think that there was a sense that they felt that they were not being heard and they were not being represented. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a sense of their grievances not being seen as serious enough to be taken on as part of the discussion. And I could understand where they were going with this. You see, those of us from the Caribbean, the Caribbean countries are mostly Black countries, mostly African descended populations. But when you have African Americans, where they make up something like is it 1/7
of the population, maybe.
Yeah, 1/7 of the population. A lot of them felt that they were not being represented in the discourse, and I think that was something that came up. Certainly, that's how I saw it. I mean, what did you think, sir?
Yes, I think so, and it's important to understand that I think reparations, in a sense, has to be represented in different ways in different countries. Shall we say, the way in which it was experienced, even though we have an overall and an overarching drive towards reparations, because as you have just intimated, the population here in the United States, which is where I'm located at the present time, let's say the African American population is 15%. Well, they need to seek reparations from the American government, the U.S. Congress, etc. And also, if you are living in Colombia, again, I'm not sure what the population is there, but I know they have a reparations program, shall we say, that they've just started. But let's say it's 10% of the population. Again, they have to seek reparations through the government of Colombia, even if the government of Colombia then seeks reparations from Spain. So that those are individual efforts, I think, that need to be respected, but they need to understand that they have a role, but the role is not the major role in terms of the global presence of African people. That has to be carried by governments. So that has to be something that's discussed, and then each group sort of understands its place while they work together.
Can I jump in there, sir?
Yeah, please.
I think, though, what a lot of the African Americans were saying, and I suspect a lot of the Black Colombians were saying, is there a way for governments outside of the US government or outside of the Colombian government can represent them, such as the sixth region of the African Union, to fight reparations on their cause? Because here's why. If we look at the history of mass enslavement, it wasn't just the American government that's responsible for enslaving African Americans. When Britain, or it wasn't called Britain then, when it was called England, ruled the Americas, they were the people that were enslaving them. So consequently, the same English families that owned plantations in Virginia were the same families that owned plantations in Jamaica, same group of people. Which means if they make the American government the people that they're fighting reparations against, they're going after the wrong targets in many cases, because the initial target should be Britain, or as it was called then, England. Do you see? So it's a very messy situation. And I think that what a lot of people were hoping the discussion would be about is how many ways can people who are minorities in the countries that they now find themselves in, who can represent them other than the countries that they're in? And there was, I think, one of the areas of frustration is a lot of African Americans and a lot of African Colombians felt homeless politically because nobody else was really embracing them. I mean, what do you think to that, sir?
Well, I think it's a good point. I think also that there's no such thing really as the sixth region in terms of an entity. I mean, it's a conceptual entity, but in terms of an entity that has a presence and has an authority to speak for the diaspora in the sixth region, it really doesn't exist at this point in that sort of way. It's again.
So can I jump in there, sir?
But it's still being crafted. Go ahead.
Yeah. Do you think we need to explain to the audience who and what the sixth region is? Do you think we need to say that?
I think it's a good idea. Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. When we're talking about the African Union, they divide the continent of Africa into 5 zones, which are represented by, if you like, the land blocks that make up those 5 zones. When it comes to Black people in the diaspora, they like to use this cover-all term called the region, include Black people in Britain, Black people in France, and so forth. But the problem here is that unlike the different blocks in Africa, where they actually have governments, when it comes to the sixth region, those Black people living outside Africa, we do not have our own government, and therefore, are we really represented by the African Union? And this is, again, a major point of discussion. Do you think we'd like to jump in, sir?
Yeah, I think what you just ended on saying is a point of discussion, I think is important, because that's where it's at, and we need to discuss it. and it's important to discuss because ultimately we need to have a unified front. But if you go down the road and say, okay, we're successful at reparations, then you will also realize that reparations has to be dealt with in each area in terms of its relationship to that area historically. So that the end result is going to have to be the Colombian government or Spain, whatever, dealing with the Afro-Colombians, and the American government dealing with the African Americans. I don't think you're going to have the British anymore dealing with African Americans. I think that tie was cut back there in, what was it, 1776. This is the reality that we face. I think, however, though, the solution, as you're saying, in terms of the discussion, is that we need to have one overarching, shall we say, database that we're going to work from and work with. So that even though they're disparate pieces, they're seamless. But that can only be done with, the proper historical perspective that is able to link all of these different pieces. And I think you need to get in there now as a historian and tell us how we can link all of that in terms of a narrative that we're going to say to the West. Because that's what we're talking about. Like you said, we're not just talking about the Portuguese, but the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Dutch, the British, whatever, and that is the overarching, shall we say, reality, and that we have to place this as quotes, global African people presenting the situation in detail to the Europeans who, created the slave trade. So this is a huge tapestry.
And I think you've hit the nail on the head. Certainly, for those of us living in Britain, the first scholar that we've had to tackle it, so we're not looking at it from a CARICOM perspective, we're looking at it from a UK perspective, is Professor Robert Beckford. And Professor Beckford did a documentary called The Empire Pays Back, where he commissioned some hotshot lawyers and accountants and that kind of thing, with the view to finding out how would we go about conceptualizing how much the British Empire owes to its formerly enslaved people. And they came up with three notional figures. One figure was for how many enslaved people did the British Empire control, and therefore how much unpaid wages were there. And then can that unpaid wage figure be compounded so that we end up with a 2005 figure? Professor Beckford's work was 2005. So now we would compound it for a 2023 figure. The second figure would be how much could a case be made against the British government for unjust enrichment, where using unjust means they enrich themselves and enrich the country, and then coming with a notional figure there, and then compounding that figure for 2005. Again, if we were doing it today, it'd be 2023. And then thirdly, can we come with a figure for false imprisonment? If somebody has been imprisoned, and that would be the exact analogy with being enslaved, how much would the damages be for someone that has undergone false imprisonment? And then multiply that by the numbers of people controlled by the British Empire as enslaved people, and then compounding that for 2005 prices. And then Professor Beckford and his hotshot team of lawyers and so on came with a notional figure of 7.5 trillion pounds at 2005 prices. And that's what the British Empire owes. Now, for me,
the British Empire owes who?
the descendants of those people who were enslaved.
Where?
Oh, all those people controlled by the British Empire.
Okay.
So, the idea was
that would include those in the United States of America, those in the Caribbean.
That's the point. That's the point, and that's why the African Americans, in my opinion, would be unwise to just go after the American government, because it wasn't just the American government that enslaved them. Do you see?
Interesting. You know, and again, this is very enlightening. I think it's very important to have this conversation. And this type of conversation needs to really be broad-based in terms of others having the same conversation, because I think its conclusion, whatever, is of extreme importance. Because again, if you look at the Caribbean, shall we say, or people in the Caribbean, in different Caribbean countries, and you look at yourself, Caribbean ancestry, but living in England, and you know, that whole generation again that came after World War II and set up England, etc., etc. So you're subjects.
Yeah.
Basically, the people in the Caribbean are no longer British subjects, or many of them aren't. Some, you know, some are still Commonwealth people, but some, you know, some are republics, etc., etc. Now, when you're quantifying that, if you look at what Carrie Cummins has been doing, Sir Hilary Beckles and Marie Shepherd, they've been looking at the damage that has been done in the Caribbean, and they're talking a lot about education. They're talking about healthcare, and they're not, and they're talking about really the development of societies, as opposed to a number that might be given to an individual. And I think this is where, again, we need to back up, and you need to comment here, because those figures and that approach is based on a number, and that number now is going to be shared by a certain number of people. So you're saying that the British Empire, or whatever you want to call it, or the British government at the present time, let's say they owe whatever the number of trillions, whatever the number of millions of African people, wherever they are, and this is going to be dispersed as a monetary figure. And that's very interesting, because that's also happening in the United States. That, you know, the bill in front of the Congress, which is HR 40, you know, they're looking at, you know, what does reparations mean? And I think the people out in California, the government of California, have actually come up with a number in terms of each individual that can prove an ancestor who was enslaved will get X. Now, this is very interesting, because I totally disagree with the X method, because I don't think it's going to change anything. But I think that's part of the current approach. What's there?
And this is why I think we need to be doing things like the Accra conference, so that these different approaches can be discussed, and we can find holes in our different approaches. And by listening to another group of reparations people to find out, do they have a superior approach and a superior way of quantifying it? What Professor Beckford wanted to do was, we know the amount of people that were enslaved by the British Empire, right? So that's, once we've got a figure, and then we've got a notional time frame from the start of the Royal African Company right up until the 1800s. That's our time frame. We know how many people. We can then work out what's the average. If those people weren't enslaved, how much would they have earned if they were paid laborers? You got that figure, multiply it by the amount of people, and then we ended up with something like £4 trillion. We could then do the same thing with unjust enrichment, and we could do the same thing with false imprisonment, and that's how Professor Beckford came to 7.5 trillion. Now, he doesn't talk about how many people got thrown overboard and how much their lives were worth. That didn't even enter the discussion. Clearly, that needs to go into the discussion.
Stick up in there. You're correct. And again, there are different ways in which to add up and come up with a number. But you see, that is approaching it, I think, from the perspective of, shall we say, civil society,
Yeah,
and also, from the perspective of a minority within a government.
yeah.
But if you approach it from the perspective of a nation,
Mm-hmm.
I think you'll see the perspective differently, because any one of the African nations, in terms of reparations, well, reparations for them means, like everybody else, repairing the damage.
Yeah.
Well, certainly within a country like the United States, you can put a monetary figure to it, and that's not so bad, although we'll come back to that. But within a nation, let's just take Ghana, that is indebted to the World Bank, to the IMF, and to the system. And my perspective then is a systems analysis, because I think the same system that gave you chattel slavery is the same system that gave you colonialism, and the same system that now is giving you globalization, imperialism, neocolonialism, whatever you want to call it, at the present time. And a monetary value, a monetary compensation is not going to change the system. And the system currently has its claws into nation states. Again, over time, because of the whole Bretton Woods thing, which took over from 1884, 1885, ideology, shall we say, that concretized the colonial pursuit within Africa. Bretton Woods, took over the imperial design to get at African riches. And unless you include some sort of transformation within those systems, you can't really come up with a monetary value that is meaningful to a nation. Because okay, let's suppose instead of a monetary value, it's a cancellation of debt. So you cancel the debt, but are you any better off than before? You could say yes, but you're back at ground zero. You don't have anything with which to develop. So so where do you go? Do you borrow money again from the IMF or from the World Bank? You can't do that. You have to change the system so that you now are able to develop. And well, we are in this situation because you are purposely underdeveloped while they were taking your human resources and they've been taking your mineral resources and other resources out of your country without adequate compensation. But it can't be just a matter of compensation, because you would be in the same boat, because you still owe all of these monies, or the system will not have changed in terms of, let's look at the Congo and taking minerals out without paying any taxes, destroying villages and whole territories, as well as human beings in terms of the wars and so on and so forth. So it really is quite a panorama, and it needs to be elucidated and discussed just as we're discussing it. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think what needs to happen here is we need to be having separate discussions. They're all going to be called reparations, but they are separate discussions, because I think the crimes against Africans between 1441 and 1888 is chapter 1 of reparations. You see, what happened during the colonial period is a separate chapter requiring a separate set of legal challenges. So in other words, destroying the empire of Benin, the Great Walls of Benin, that's a crime that needs to be atoned for. Enslaving the people of Congo during the Congo Free State, that's another separate crime. Putting the Kikuyu nation into concentration camps between, I think it's 1954 and 1962, that's another set of crimes. Putting the Nama and Herero into concentration camps, that's another set of crimes. And I think we need to keep them separate so that we don't get this idea that it's one set of issues when in fact there's separate sets of issues. In other words, I could imagine a situation where legal charges are brought against the same groups of people for very different crimes. And that, so that way there's no overlap. You know, like when someone is accused of 10 different crimes, you try and, my thing is keep all 10 separate. Do you see? And in that way, we end up with a lot more intellectual clarity in just what it is that we, the African people of the planet Earth, are actually asking for.
Yeah, I think that they need to be kept separately in terms of an investigation of the crimes.
Yeah.
But in terms of their presentation, they need to be presented, I would say, collectively, even if it's collectively sequentially.
Agreed.
Because if you look at that, and I'm going to do maybe just 2 points. One, I think you and I agree, or at least I came away from the conference with the idea that there needs to be a committee of experts. I think that was actually stated in the conference program, but it didn't happen. It was not announced. Now, we're fearful, some of us discussing it are fearful that committee of experts might simply mean a bunch of lawyers or politicians or what have you, which is fine when you're going to present something, but they need to have something to present, and it has to be an encyclopedic analysis of the crimes as we are talking about them in these different places, Namibia, South Africa, Congo, etc., etc., etc. So you need scholars like yourself, historians, economists, educators, health experts, to elucidate all of these different areas, geographic areas, as well as conceptual areas, cultural areas that are relevant to the discourse, and then be able to conglomerate all of this material, and then have it available to these, I don't want to call them experts, but the presenters, shall we say. Yeah. Because I think what was coming out of the conference, and maybe we need to go at this a little bit at a time. My understanding, basically from the lawyers, well, first of all, let's say that simply a moral argument is not going to work, because it hasn't worked so far. Now, will a legal argument work? I think I got from the discussion by the lawyers that a legal argument by itself won't work, for the simple reason that there's no real precedent. You can't say, even though we say this happened to the Japanese in America, they got some form of reparations. The people who enslaved us got reparations. The Jews got reparations for their Holocaust. But there seems to be no precedent really for what we're talking about in terms of crimes against humanity and total genocide over that period of time. And people seem to be saying that at that time when it happened, there was no legislation against it. So you can't present a legal argument when there was no legal precedent at that time. And in some sense, that may be correct, but of course, it's simply a slick way to try to get out of a situation. So they will keep saying that. So the legal argument alone, it will not be conclusive. But what was coming out of it was a tribunal that would be decided on at the United Nations. And I think this is of extreme importance, because if you have a tribunal, then it could be like the Nuremberg trial, so to speak, in terms of this special tribunal related to crimes against humanity and genocide against the African people, et cetera, and discussed at the United Nations. And then it would have to be binding on the Security Council and all of this kind of stuff. So when you're going to pursue it in that way, you need tremendous documentation, because then you're going to need allies. Okay, we're 55 countries or 54, whatever, in Africa. We're 15, I think, in the Caribbean. But we need to get 90 plus a yes vote, shall we say, at the United Nations. So you need to go to allies. So, so you have to have this document as you're going to sit down and convince the Chinese, the Russians, the Afghanistans, or the Arabs, or what have you, that they need to come out on your side, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm making the case for really, really serious documentation by a committee of experts.
When the idea of the committee of experts was mooted, was it the idea that that would be agreed at this conference, or is it that the list will be drawn up after the conference? I mean, what impression did you get, sir?
Well, it was stated on an early agenda, which I got through somebody, that the committee of experts would be named at the conference.
Yeah.
But that was not available to the public. The one that we got at the event did not include that.
Yeah.
And there were no committee of experts was actually called for or stated at the conference that I heard. I didn't go to every single thing, but certainly the wrap-up did not include a committee of experts. Now, I have not received anything yet in terms of formal accounting of the conference. I don't know if you haven't received anything either, have you?
No, I haven't either.
Yeah, but supposedly they were supposed to come up with something, after 2 or 3 days or something like that and distribute it. I haven't received anything yet. I haven't inquired if others have or what the situation is. But that would be the final word in terms of whether they did set up a committee or not. But in terms of my experience, what I heard, what I saw, a committee was not set up. It was not on the active agenda at the time of the conference, although it was a thought in the earlier agenda. So one could think, therefore, that maybe there is hanky-panky in the background. I don't know.
Okay. But one thing, sir, that overhearing your conversation with the Beijing ambassador, and I think the people watching would probably benefit from this, is can you share some information on the evolution of reparations? Because a lot of people will think reparations is a new word. They've heard this word for the first time in 2023. People are talking about it 2023, but obviously there's a long history involving a whole bunch of players in Africa, in the Caribbean, among the African Americans, among the Black Brazilians, and so on, that you would have a knowledge of that I don't think the viewers know this information. So do you think that would be useful, sir?
Yes and no. My knowledge is not that detailed, because I'm not that kind of person that does conferences, shall we say. But definitely based on what was said at the time and minimal knowledge, shall we say, over time. Certainly the Africans have been involved with reparations, at least conceptually in terms of conference and statements, etc., since around 2007. So that they're just coming on board now at the Accra conference. And this was one of the things that was brought up in terms of dispelling this idea, which sort of came out of the American delegation, shall we say, or at least a member of the American delegation, that Africa was Johnny come lately. And I think also David Kamisong, who was the Barbadian ambassador to CARICOM, and who was present, gave some interesting information about the Durban conference, which I think was that 2001 or was that 2011? I'm not sure. But anyway, that conference was dealing with racism and reparations, and the Caribbean took a very strong position, etc. And Africa was involved, but when it came to reparation, of course, America not participate. No, but the African nations participated. But when it comes to drafting the paper, shall we say, or the approach, a number of the African delegations backed out and left others hanging, which would be Caribbean as well as African American there. Now, David gave some details relative to that, because what had happened was that the American delegation, so to speak, and this is not the African Americans, but the American ambassador, et cetera, government put pressure on the African governments not to participate in terms of the document. So now however, many of the ambassadors were completely, at a loss as to what had happened. So it was not that Africa did not support the Durban Declaration. It was that many heads of state were forced to walk away from it because of pressure from the United States. So, so the African participation has continued, I think from 2001 onwards, et cetera, in different conferences and so on and so forth. So, that's just my sort of overall understanding of it. But I think, what took place here in Accra just recently here in November is very significant. Now, bear in mind also that we had an Accra conference last August, the first week in August last year, which I was at. And that conference was orchestrated largely by civil society here in the United States of America, Ron Daniels and other people, the Reparations Committee here in the United States. And they had just come off a visit to the Vatican and so on. They've done a lot of good work. So this Accra conference was not the first Accra conference. And it's part of this sort of feeling that they were slighted when this conference was being put as if it was the first Accra conference. And the conference, which was, a year and change before, was not being acknowledged. But Africa was represented at that conference as well. So it's a little bit of a fraught history, but that's the way things go. I mean, it's not going to go smoothly and so on and so forth. But I think at this point, everybody's on board. But as we're saying, discussions need to continue because there are problems and it has to be made seamless over time in terms of how we then are going to, shall we say, definitively deal with this. I just want to make one other point. I think it was mentioned at the conference, but if it wasn't, I think we're thinking that 2025 is the year of reparations, when everything is going to be presented and, it has to happen then or whatever. I suppose that then 2024 would be the year leading up to that. So that a lot of work now has to be done in terms of preparation, in terms of getting our acts together and dealing with this sort of information that we're talking about that needs to come out of, the United States of America, for example, in terms of all that has happened, from slavery through Jim Crow, through, police brutality, imprisonment of African Americans, and so on and so on and so forth, as well as, let's say what's happened in Britain. How, pretty much the same thing happens in Britain in terms of police brutality and taking away citizenship from the Windrush people. And all of those things need to be very, very properly documented in order to make the case comprehensive, 2024.
All right, powerful points, sir. All right, let me just throw in a few other ideas. One of the big discoveries that where my research has been going is when people look at coming with a notional figure for how much was an enslaved African worth, the impression that is given is that these enslaved Africans were all plantation workers, and therefore how much is a farmer worth? And that's a reasonable way to begin the discussion. But what it doesn't do is, what about those enslaved Africans who turned their enslavers into the equivalent of millionaires? Consequently, their value wasn't just another farmer, but they changed the game. And I can think of, off the top of my head, 5 such examples where African folk tales became transformed into Uncle Remus stories, making fortunes for Joel Chandler Harris. Those same folk tales were transformed into Peter Rabbit, making millions for Beatrice Potter. How the enslaved African Joe Anderson helped build the mechanical reaper in 1834 that made a multi-millionaire out of Cyrus McCormick, who was able to make this money as in agriculture using this mechanical reaper. How Oscar Stewart was able to use the technology invented by his slave Ned, which then created the cotton scraper, where he made a fortune out of the cotton scraper, and even advertised that, yes, this was invented by a Negro slave. And then, of course, you've got the most controversial of them all, the Jack Daniels legacy, where it is now being admitted that the whiskey recipe was produced by the enslaved African Nathan Nearest Green. And so consequently, the value of Nathan Nearest Green, the value of Ned, the value of Joe Anderson isn't just the value of a regular farmer. And the multi-millions that these people created needs to be factored into any kind of discussion on mass enslavement and reparations, in my opinion. I think that needs to be a part of the discussion, sir.
Absolutely, absolutely. And your presentation at the conference was outstanding because, you brought everything up to date in terms of even recent discoveries of our technological prowess in Africa that was brought over to the Americas. You can also extend that, and this in some sense bolsters my argument more in terms of making it, wider. But a crime against humanity is that you can't value a human life. There's no such monetary value on a human life, even one human life. And this is where we have to really come down on it. And there were 50 million minimum human lives that were disrupted, oppressed, murdered, all kinds of things. I mean, this is such a vast crime that it boggles the mind. We don't comprehend it because we don't believe that human beings can be so beastly. And we look at 6 million, Jewish people in the Holocaust, the ovens and so on. And somehow our minds gets around that and we say, oh, that's horrible. But it doesn't say that we're able to get around 50 million Africans and something that occurred over 400 years and was multiplied year after year with different methods that were refined to oppress, imprison, and dehumanize. I mean, my God, it's just evil, and you can't get your mind around the evil. I think you wanted to say something.
Yeah, and here's the thing. Working out why there's sympathy for the millions of Jews, but almost no sympathy for us, is because the Jews in Europe during World War II were seen as sophisticated people. Right? They produced people like Rubinstein. They produced people like Einstein. They produced great artists, great musicians, great thinkers, the psychoanalytic movement, which then became the basis of psychology. They produced a lot of that stuff. So there's respect for them because they were people of culture. Now, here's the thing. If we are going to change the way we are seen, we are going to have to emphasize that our enslaved Africans were also people of culture. We have to emphasize that our enslaved ancestors were people that produced things of value, and those things of value were, no disrespect to farmers, but more than just farming. And this is why we have to get on code when it comes to what we talk about when it comes to enslaved Africans. Let me give you an example. Now, I don't like giving this example because we shouldn't even be having this discussion. But whatever happened to Jewish people during World War II, the same thing happened to the Gypsies, the Roma. Exactly the same thing happened. They were in the same camps. But nobody feels sorry for the Roma because the Roma were not seen as people of culture. Now, I know that that shouldn't be the equation, but unfortunately, we live in a world where that is the equation. So, to kill people who are not seen as people of culture, that's no crime. It only becomes a crime when you kill people who are seen as people of culture. So let's be clear. I'm not saying the Roma are not people of culture. I'm saying they are not seen as people of culture. And here's the thing, neither are we. And this is why we have to emphasize that what enslaved Africans did, not only were we doing farming, we were using very advanced farming techniques that pulled more out of the American soils than European farmers using their technologies. That's why they picked their technologies over ours. The same is true with cotton. The same is true with metallurgy. The same is true with mining. The same is true with carpentry. And then we've got those specific examples of enslaved Africans producing particular technologies that made millions for their enslavers. You see, what this does is it infuses those ancestors with a dignity that nobody else is really talking about. And I think that's where the reparations discussion needs to go. If we are going to win over non-Africans to at least respect the value and merit of our cause, because they're going to have to see us as people of culture.
And, I think that's an extremely important point, Robin. I never thought of that myself. And in some sense, once you mention it, it's obvious because that has been the rationale for the changing of history from shall we say the old model to the Aryan model, which the historian who describes that history was rewritten, so to speak, in the 17th and 18th century, and that was done largely to justify the brutality against African people, because before that, the facts of African civilization being primary and fertilizing both Greece and Rome, as well as the Near East, et cetera, was understood, and that was part of historical fact. And what that brings us to is the whole business of education and miseducation. And we have been miseducated, so we believe it. Most of us believe that we didn't bring anything to the table because we've been taught that over 400 years. And our educational systems still repeat that kind of thing. And as you know that silly fellow in Florida and so on and so forth wants to tell us that we have benefited from slavery because we were so benighted and so on and so forth, and Europeans were so elevated that slavery was good for us. But that's the kind of not just misinformation, but that's the kind of foundation, which is exactly what you're saying, that is behind the disrespect for us, because we've been dehumanized. And we were treated as cattle, if you will, in terms of chattel slavery. So everything was taken away from us, and that made us self-respecting human beings, and which obviously included our history, including our identity. And this is what we have not dealt with. And how
Yeah.
we get back to my father, was liberated from my instrumental slavery, because while, others may help us to free the body, none but ourselves can free the mind. And our educational system has not dealt with that at all. Now, what you're saying is not only does our educational system have to deal with it, but we have to educate other people to the understanding that we are humans, and obviously we're the first humans, and we're the first civilized humans, so that we have to, shall we say, reattach ourselves to our own ancient history, which we have been disconnected from, identity-wise and historical-wise, in order to make us whole beings ourselves, and in order for us to take our proper place in terms of civilization of nations and the new world order. Something I think I brought up at the conference, that China is going its own civilizational way. They understand their history. They know all about Taoism and Lao Tse and Confucianism, etc., etc. India is going its own way. They know all about Vedanta and Buddha, etc. So what is the African civilization mode? We have not defined that for ourselves. Our scholars have let us down.
I'm trying my bit to correct that.
Oh, of course you are. Of course you are. That's the idea of in that event. And you showed that at the conference, and you've shown that in all of your work, because you're not just a historian, but you're an educator. And the Black Secret Education Project, as is shown behind you, is major in terms of that direction. And that's what we need. You see what I mean? This is the kind of stuff that hopefully should come out of a conference like that. Reconstructing ourselves and our civilization, to make us whole, and to make us then present ourselves at the table of nations as an ancient civilization, the most ancient civilization, with all of the capacities and what we've produced over time. Because quite frankly, as you and I know, most of what the Europeans are talking about, they're borrowed from Africa, and they misunderstood it. If you look at religion, you look at philosophy, certainly they didn't understand what we call, well, we didn't have a word for religion. It was spirituality, and certainly their philosophy is nonsense, because it's just speculative, where our philosophy basically is based on wisdom and the experience of our own spirituality and oneness with the universe. I mean, and they've gone an aberration, 16 centuries of nonsense, and that has piled up. And this is what our scholars need to pick at and deconstruct it and say, this is nonsense, because what has it produced? It's producing, global warming and climate change. We're destroying how many species of plants and animals. Human beings are being destroyed with their agricultural processes. The obesity is rampant, drug abuse is rampant, pederasty is rampant. People don't know what sex they belong to. The social order is breaking down. I mean, anytime there's a problem, they solve it by killing people. War on top of war on top of war on top of war. And it's always the Europeans who are causing these wars. I mean, they're like a pestilence. I hate to say that in public, but my goodness.
Yeah, so this is one of the reasons why I believe very, very much we have to change the enslavement narrative, because this is what I want to change it from and to. I want to change it from the idea, okay, Black people built Kemet, but nothing else. I want to change it from that to, we built Kemet, but even during the slave trade, Africa was still a place of science, culture, and technology. And these are the same sciences, cultures, and technologies that were brought to the Western world by enslaved people who were specifically captured for those skills. That's a complete shift in how we view those enslaved Africans. And that's the main kind of lesson that needs to inform the reparations discussion.
Robin, I think that's a good place for us to stop, and we can do reparations part 2 next week, God willing, and each of us being available. But it was wonderful to rehash the conference. It was wonderful to have a chance to talk to you in an extended fashion, and your presentation at the conference was really masterful.
So was it has to
next week.
Thank you very much again, and bye-bye.
All right, good.